journey, especially in a business-to-business sales cycle. You go from problem identification to solution exploration to requirement building to supplier selection. And the reality is you've got a lot of things going on before you ever make a decision. And there's a lot of people involved too. So you've got a buying center that could include 10 people, right? And so what's happening is you're doing independent online research, white paper downloads over here, another person downloads something over there, somebody attends an event, goes to a webinar, they get into discussions over LinkedIn, and what happens is this journey just becomes really complex. And the tracking around that journey is also really complex, right? And so that's kind of the topic we're going to talk about today is how do you track all of this stuff in a way that's meaningful, right? As I mentioned, the purchasing decisions are made in buying groups, right? Your decision maker, your manager, whoever, often has to get approvals. Like you have a CEO or a CFO. You might have IT get involved. You have influencers that are teammates, and all of them have a say in this ultimate buying decision, right? And so today's, especially in the B2B world, this does happen a little bit in the consumer world, but it's not nearly as complex. You might have one person making a decision, or maybe two people if you're like in a household. But in the B2B environment specifically, this is what it looks like. There are just a lot of players. This is some studies done by Forrester. So in 2006, they came out with the demand waterfall. Have you ever heard of the demand waterfall? This is kind of the traditional, I've got inquiries that turn into marketing qualified leads, the sales accepts them, they qualify them, they close business, right? Well, in 2012, they did a re-architected waterfall where they had a kind of more of an inbound-outbound approach where they've got inbound leads coming into an SDR team, and you got outbound efforts going from the BDR team, and they come in and they kind of go through this similar flow, a little different though, and they came up with this idea of an automation qualified lead, or AQL, and a teleprospecting accepted lead, or a TAL, and they'd break it out in TQLs and TGLs and SALs. There's a lot of acronyms here, right, of like the different types of leads. And the idea is that all of these kind of came down into two flows of closed business, one which was really driven by an outbound effort, and then the other one was driven by an inbound effort. More recently, they've come out with a new revenue waterfall strategy where it's really centered around the buying group, right? And so in the buying group, what you see is you actually see current customers becoming a big part of the sales play instead of just prospective customers. And so when you look at it from an ABM waterfall perspective, so an account-based marketing approach, right? A big part of that is actually customers. How do you get more out of your current customers? And also targeting, right? So what they've said is, hey, you've defined your target market. Now you've got to create awareness and detect active buying groups. So we've come to recognize, hey, guess what? It's not a single person decision. It's actually a buying group decision. And so if we're going to go and try to penetrate an account, then we should be focusing on buying groups, right? And that's essentially what this model is showing, is that you need to attract and engage buying group members, associate and prioritize those buying groups, then qualify early stage opportunities, validate their needs, and then align those solutions to it, right? It's a little bit of a different approach, similar idea, but what it's saying is marketing really should be thinking about all of sales. And guess what? Sales represents a huge chunk, or existing customers represents a huge chunk of closed won revenue. Add-on licenses, cross-sells, upsells, renewals. You see also the customer success team playing into this, right? And what I like about this approach is it's more real, right? And it also ties marketing and sales together, right? And to say, hey, look, I don't care where the revenue comes from. What we should be doing is focusing on the places it comes from. And whether that's from existing customers or new customers and the buying group. So there is some ideas even now it's saying instead of even focusing, excuse me, instead of focusing on the account level, you really should be focusing on the opportunity level if you're thinking about Salesforce, or the deal level, or in this case, buying group level, right? Hey, you're going to go after this account, that's great, especially if you have multiple products, which happens in a lot of enterprise companies, right? They've got 10 products they could sell into it. They need to be looking at the buying groups that are related to each of those products and making more of a product-centric approach. Okay, so here's the challenge, right? There's a lot of, from a tracking perspective, right? So you got all these things going on all over the place. You have all this anonymous account activity that's happening before they ever fill out a form on your website or make a purchase decision. You used to be able to get a lot of data from marketing automation tools, Google Analytics. You know, I threw on here this not provided keyword. And if you remember in the earlier days, you would be able to see all sorts of really valuable keyword information about your visitors. The organic search, and you can kind of see this today in Search Console, but it's just different, right? There's also privacy laws that have prevented, companies, like even Demandbase, some of these ABM tools, 6 Sense, Terminus, think of HubSpot, where basically you don't get anything until they fill out a form. And then when they fill out the form, they might bring in all that data with it, right? But until they fill out the form and they've given you explicit permission, you really don't know what's going on. So these tools like Demandbase and 6 Sense and Terminus, what they try to do is they try to de-anonymize those activities, and they try to create intent signals around them. What's hard about that though is they often use the IP address of the person that's visiting. And they say, okay, if let's say we're in the Kiln building, right? That makes it hard, right? We're in a co-working space, one. So which company in Kiln is actually visiting your site? If you're in a work from home environment, how do you know that that IP address is associated with the company that you're talking to? COVID really threw a wrench in these guys' platforms. And in fact, I've done multiple studies with Demandbase and Terminus at least, where at best they're 40% accurate, right? So you spend a whole bunch of money on this ABM tool to try to de-anonymize this account activity data, and you're still only 40%. 40% of the people that are coming are actually identified correctly, right? And in fact, most of them don't even get identified as part of the account. The other challenge you've had is this third-party cookie ban, right? So, third-party cookies are dead. What do? You got challenges like iOS changing their rules, right? And so it makes it harder to track data before the form submission, right? What you can do, though, is you can use first-party cookies to track at least the first touch and last touch kind of behavior that is really helpful when they do finally fill out the form, and then you can bring that data in with the form. So if you don't have a tool like a Marketo or a HubSpot, you can use Google Tag Manager to create that cookie for you, and it'll attach it. If you're using something like Marketo or HubSpot, they often have that with them as part of it, although I don't like their categorization and the way they do it. But you can see here in HubSpot, this example, right? You might be able to see the original source, drill down 1 or 2. The challenge even here then is like, if it integrates from another system, say you integrate with Salesforce or Drift or something else that actually creates that lead, that's what you get is this offline source, which again isn't very helpful. Import, okay, and then some number, right, that represents some API. So it's challenging to actually track along that journey, right? The other thing that's a little bit challenging, right, is you have leads that come into the CRM from a variety of sources. So in this example here, see if I can click into there's the, oh, there it is. Oh, you can't really see it. In this example here, like a website form, for example, well, you've got all these channels driving to your website, right? So you might go, direct traffic, organic search, referring sites, organic social, paid search, paid display. You might have landing pages that you create in HubSpot or somewhere else. And they come to your website, they might call you. Well, as soon as they call you, guess what? All that online tracking just went away, right? They might chat with you on live chat, right? Guess what? Some of that, unless you're bringing that data into your live chat, you're going to miss that information. They might start a product trial. So if your product is integrated on your website and they start the product trial and you don't have those forms integrated, guess what? You miss all that data again, right? Or they might fill out your website form. The best case scenario from a marketing side is, hey, fill out the website form because guess what? I'm going to get data if you fill out the website form. If you decide to come in any other way, you're missing some data. And then you've got things like partners, that might be doing API calls to send leads over, or events or trade shows where you're importing a list. Or what about an email introduction to a sales guy? Hey, I want to make this introduction to my friend. How do you track those kinds of things? Manual entry comes right into the CRM. So these things, guess what? You're missing, your marketing automation tool isn't even touching those things until later, that somehow they come into Salesforce or Zoho or wherever it is, and there's nothing other than it got created by somebody, right? So you can see that the tracking of the leads, it becomes complex in these environments. Now, again, if it was just one person from one company trying to go through this journey, that's one thing, but really you've got buying centers going through these journeys, right? I might have 10 people from a company coming. I've got one from an event and one from content syndication partner, right? And they're all coming in. How do you track and manage all that? That's what we're talking about today. How do you do that? So, one, understand it. Understand how leads are coming into your system so that you can categorize them, right? I like to use UTM parameters. So UTM, Universal Tracking Metrics, are a good way to start this journey and to have a consistent strategy around how you use these UTM values. So I actually like to use the UTM medium in a program sense. Have you ever used UTM medium before? You know what I'm talking about with, say, UTM medium? Most people are like, I don't even know what that's for. Usually it's like email. It usually says email, PPC, paid, something. It's like useless. Like the information you usually get from a UTM medium field value. So what I do is I like to use that field in a little bit different way from what the standard, like Google, if you were to go Google, like, what are all the fields? I like to say, hey, let's categorize the high-level programs that we're using. Let's use UTM medium to that. It's a common metric that Google Analytics uses, that other places use. You can organize it. So I like to use medium, source, campaign. Your tactic might be like an ad group, term, content. This one is not a standard one, the tactic field or an ad group field. It's not a standard UTM. But you can create whatever you want. UTMs are just fields. So what you can do is you can use Marketing Automation Tool or Google Tag Manager to capture and store these UTM parameters in a first-party cookie. So whenever they come back to your site, I can say, okay, this is the thing that actually brought you to my site. And I can store those values in a cookie. So regardless of whether they bounce around on your site, leave, come back 30 days later, I have that cookie that will then populate the form information whenever they decide to come in and do it, right? There's another idea that if you wanted to do last touch as well, you could essentially create two types of cookies. One is a first touch cookie and one's a last touch. Either way, when they fill out the form, you could gather all of that information. If you don't have an automation tool that does this for you, this is where Tag Manager is really helpful because you can use Tag Manager to create these processes for you. That making sense so far? Yeah. So, one of the keys to success around this tracking attribution model is that you lay out your UTM tracking model, right? So in this case, it's just a Google sheet. I like to break it up in two different ways. If I'm using a campaign object in Salesforce, for example, or in Zoho, I want to use basically a type and tactic so there's a default field called type on the campaign object. And what they do, if you're using an ABM tool, they use this type field for other things. So it's nice to align to that type field because it's used in other places. And then you just create another pick list So type and tactic, and then the actual name just is the combination of this. When you're bringing in the UTM values, there's a lot of way, if you organize it the right way, you can get a lot of insights into the different channels that you have. So for example, let's say website direct. You might say, okay, my medium is website direct, my UTM source might be direct traffic, but what I could do is I could actually section out my site and say, okay, well, did the direct traffic come to my homepage? Was it part of the blog? Like what part of my site did they actually come from? And then I could even bring in the website page or some sort of form or offer that they filled out. So I can get that information. And so now when I look at website direct and I say, hey, where did this lead come from? Instead of saying, oh, it came from the website, I could actually say, hey, it came from my blog. And this was the blog. And then I could actually measure influence around blog, right? And so if you organize this in a way that gives you the data at those different UTM values, you end up with a ton of really great detailed data that can be later used. And has anybody ever set any of this up before for their companies? One hand, yeah? Okay. If you lay it all out, then what you do is you can create what is called a UTM builder, and it can standardize that data for you, make it a little easier. Especially if you've got a lot of people creating campaigns. So basically what you do is just say, hey, go in here, select from the list, pick the values, and keep it standardized. Once it becomes unstandardized, it's hard to report on it the way you want. Now, it doesn't mean you're like doom and gloom or anything. It just means you can't run it the same kind of way versus starting out right and segmenting it that way. Okay. If you're ever implementing this and you want the code for the JavaScript code for Google Tag Manager, let me know, because I can send it to you. You can actually import this. You don't have to go rewrite this every time you do it. There's actually, you can import a container into Google Tag Manager, and that container can possess all the stuff that we've done. So we do it all the time for our clients. And what we do is we take this container, we import it into Tag Manager, and then we go through and modify a few things to kind of align it to the way that they work. And what this is doing is it's basically saying, hey, if there's ever a UTM parameter in the URL, or even if there's not, so say it comes from like an organic search or some other place, I want to interpret that and then bring it in and actually standardize the way that when it comes into the form, I'm actually getting data that is meaningful. And so we often do this because even like HubSpot, where they've laid it all out and said, hey, here's all your traffic sources, they don't maybe lay it out the way you want to lay it out. They're not really taking into account events, for example, at a high level. So I like to control that. So, basically what we're saying, hey, check the URL, see if you see values. If there's no values, then, is this an organic search? Is this a direct? Is this a social? And then you can store those values in a first touch or last touch cookie. When somebody finally fills out the form, guess what? You get all that data, right? So I'm going to assume a Salesforce model for our discussion here. The Salesforce does the multi-touch attribution model the best, in my opinion, of the different CRMs. So basically what's going to happen, right, is you've got this anonymous account activity. If you use Tag Manager or some sort of marketing automation tool, you can capture these first touch and last touch values. And then when they finally fill out the form, that contact will actually contain those values. There'll be filled values that will show, hey, this was from paid search. This is from my branded campaign that came in on this ad group with this keyword, right? That data then syncs over usually with a Salesforce lead or a Salesforce contact. You can attach it to a campaign. There's a campaign member that gets created. These contacts are often created and associated with opportunities. But this is how basically the layout of the conversion process for a lead that comes in, right? Now, again, we're getting a little technical here, but it's important, right, to understand the dynamic of what's happening here. For a multi-touch attribution model, I like to store those UTM values actually at the campaign member level. So a lot of times what you'll do, if you're doing a basic setup, you'll have your UTM parameters on your lead object, maybe on your opportunity object, maybe somewhere else, right? The challenge is it's a single point in time, and it doesn't represent the journey of what we talked about earlier, right? Hey, there was an event. They clicked on a LinkedIn ad. They did this thing. They did that, right? If you use a single perspective like a UTM field to track this, you can see a first touch model, right? So you can say, okay, I know that this came from paid search. But guess what? I lose everything else after that, right? I maybe can, and if I run a report on that, I can run a report on paid search, but I'm missing the whole thing. But if I can attach it to the campaign member object, this campaign gets attached to leads and contacts and opportunities and accounts. It's used for campaign influence and other kinds of things, and it allows you to do some really cool things, right? So we take this example, paid search, they're going to be attached to this Salesforce campaign, but this campaign doesn't contain the details of the actual click. But here we can contain the actual details of the campaign. So I can say, hey, this is paid search Google Ads, but guess what? It was from branded Sensor Tower reports, and that was actual content that they downloaded as a single point along a bigger journey, right? So then what you can do here is you can get visibility into all of this along the whole journey by doing it that way. So I can say, hey, guess what? They came from an organic search, and then they clicked a LinkedIn ad, and by the way, this was the LinkedIn ad and all the details around it. And then they went to a website visit and opened an email and clicked on retargeting ad. And guess what? This was the retargeting ad they clicked on, right? And then, oh, guess what? This is the paid search ad. They looked this up again. So now I'm seeing like detail levels along this journey, and I can actually run a report on a single contact and say, hey, guess what? This was their journey and their timeline to where they are today. And you can actually see both at kind of a high level like LinkedIn, but also at a detail level. So if I want to now say, hey, how is the marketing leaders campaign on LinkedIn doing? And how many leads and how many opportunities did it influence? I can do that now, right? And I can see that really specific detail. And it's not a single point where in most models today, basically organic search would get credit here. Or if you're doing a last touch model, maybe where they completed the form, LinkedIn might get the credit, in this case. Make sense what I'm saying so far? Okay. So in your marketing automation platform, basically what you want to do is you want to populate these first touch and last touch values. You don't ever overwrite the first touch. You overwrite the last touch. And then as you overwrite them, you can add them to Salesforce campaigns. And then there's ways you can do it. So you could run a daily workflow if you wanted to. You could, we could say, hey, show me everybody that clicked on an ad today. Show me everybody that visited a page. And if they visited a page, go add them to the campaign. If they clicked the link in an email, go add them to the campaign, or whatever it is. You do need marketing automation, or at least Salesforce processes to do this. You want to do it the right way. You want to build the vision, the Cadillac of all this. That's how you do it. So the other thing that's interesting is that if you ever tried to implement this, and I'm getting geeky here, like technical. Most marketing automation tools don't allow you to actually modify campaign members. They basically say, hey, do you want to add to a Salesforce campaign? Great. Add it. What's the status? Oh, they responded. And that's like it. That's all you get. So what you have to do on the Salesforce side is you have to actually create a workflow that takes the data from your lead or contact and then populates it over onto the campaign member field so that you can see this full journey like what I was talking about, right? And so these fields on the lead level are always changing, but every time they change, what they do is they create a campaign member associated with it. And this is just a little bit more on like, hey, a new campaign member gets created. If it's associated to a lead, then do this thing. If associated contact, do this thing. If you've never done this inside of Salesforce or tried doing this, it's probably you're like, what are you talking about, Jesse? But if you've ever tried doing it, it's actually pretty complicated. And I've done this because I've been a sales for 10 years, and I have ran into these scenarios and tried to figure it out, right? So the solution, what you do is you create a flow that just says, hey, whenever a campaign member gets created, if it's associated to a contact, go pull in the values. If it's associated to lead, go pull in the values. And then what you do is you just bring them over, and that's how you get the UTM values on the campaign member. Fascinating, right? I can see, Chris, you're just like, this is awesome, right? I know. But if you're trying to really build out a marketing automation or a multi-touch campaign, it's a lot harder than you think it is. And the tools that are in place, now there are some other more advanced tools, and there's a whole bunch of pros and cons, and we can analyze all of that. But this is a way you can realistically do it. We're right now in the process of doing this with one of our clients, where we're saying, hey, you want visibility, guess what? This is how you do it, right? You bring in ABM, what we were talking about earlier, and it gets a little more complicated because you've also got to make sure that leads are getting associated to accounts, that contacts are getting associated to opportunities, and if you want to bring in the anonymous data from like a demand base, you do it. But if you're doing ABM, really the account is what has all the data in it. So if you want to say, hey, what's going on with this account and the buying groups that are in that and all the people that are doing that and talking, you want to look at the account level. So campaign member level reporting allows you some really interesting things. So it's like, great, okay, let's assume that you get it all set up, right? So now we can ask questions like, hey, which keywords are driving new leads? Which ad campaign is influencing opportunities? Which landing page provides the most conversions? Which content piece is most viewed by target accounts? Which parts of the website are target accounts visiting? Which blog posts is the most popular for tier A accounts if we're doing an ABM strategy? What email is being clicked the most, right? You can answer those kinds of questions. And you can build really interesting reports inside of Salesforce. Now, this is the older version of Salesforce, but the concepts are still true here, right? So when I was working at Workfront, this was a campaign funnel. And we actually had it so every quarter I could see impressions, clicks, leads, opportunities, and close one at a high level. And we could break them out by the tactics that were being used. And I could see, hey, which of these programs or vendors are producing the most leads and which ones are producing the most opportunity. You can also see, hey, what's the highest cost per lead? What's my highest cost per opportunity? How do I, which campaign is influencing the most opportunities? And how does that all play out across the board? You can also, here's an example campaign report, right? I can see, here's Google search ads. What I can actually see is week over week, how many are these influencing? And I'm talking about leads and contacts. In a lot of scenarios, you're only talking about leads. Here, we can actually look at it holistically and say, hey, what are the keywords? What are the campaigns? What are the company names that these are bringing in? And you can run those reports week over week because you're getting them associated with the campaign member. Another great example is that you can look at an account report, right? So this is an example for Life Research. You can actually see that there are 4 people on this account, right? And they've had different campaigns, and you can see some of these are leads, some are contacts, right? And you can see, hey, here's the program and the subprogram and the tactic that brought those in. Or influence, right? Because here, look, this guy, he had 2 influences. That one had 2, right? This one had 2. You can see that the details of all of that as they come in, and it's super helpful when you're looking at like, hey, what's going on in that account? There's another example of some campaign reporting. If you categorize it the way I was talking about, the campaign level, right, you can see, hey, I've got this tactic or program, or medium or source, however you want to categorize it, but I can say, okay, great, here's on a primary campaign, like a first touch model, hey, this is everything that's happening, right? And I can create some really helpful reports. And if I'm bringing cost data into it, even better, because then you can run cost analysis kind of things too. You want to look at a campaign influence report, you might say, hey, here's an opportunity. Here are 3 contacts on that opportunity. Here's all the campaign touches. And then if you wanted to split out the revenue, say this is a $6 million deal, right? And you did equal attribution across it, you could actually say, hey, events got $1 million of that, right? Because it was a 1 touch point out of 6 touch points. The website, whatever it is, and then it allows you to actually run some influence reports that are really interesting. Do you think this would be helpful at all to have this kind of reporting? Have you ever seen that level of reporting at your companies? So when you're measuring the funnel, right, if you set this up right, one, you can create some nice fancy reports where you can look at the funnel, visit to inquiry, inquiry to lead. And this is more of that traditional model we were talking about in 2006, right, of the waterfall kind of idea. But, then we can start looking at, okay, what's my cost per dollar pipeline? What's my cost per booking? How long is it taking me to convert? What are the things that are influencing it? All those questions can be answered. You can run campaign performance reports, right? Now, these aren't in Salesforce. Right here, I'm showing you kind of a visual of a slide you might present. But I can look at, hey, here's paid. I had this many inquiries and this many leads and this many appointments and this much pipeline. I could also add, hey, this is direct, but guess what? Paid actually influenced another 5 million, Hey, if I'm going to go first touch, this is what's happening. But if I want to look at how much is actually influenced, I could see a totally different report because I'm doing multi-channel attribution on this. Might look at organic or email or whatever you want to do, right? You can also do some really interesting dashboards inside of Salesforce or somewhere else, right? I could look at, what are the top 10 keywords? What's the highest cost per appointment? What's the 10 best offers by appointment? What are the 10 best appointment sources? Which departments are filling out these in? What industries? What's my highest cost per lead? Or, you get a lot of this information is available if you set it all up. And there's just a ton of value in doing that, right? My advice is that you try to focus your efforts on the part of the funnel that you can influence. So in this example, like the previous quarter, this is when I was at Workfront. So this is, I don't know how much I'm giving away here. I guess they've been bought and it wasn't even Workfront at the time, it was that task. But I said, what, I bet you I can influence cost per appointment. Right? Because really in the end, who cares how many leads we have? It's all about appointments for the reps. Otherwise, they're not qualified, whatever, right? So I said, well, what if we could tweak some of the things we do to actually try to lower that cost per appointment? So even here on the front end, my cost per inquiry or cost per form submission went way up, actually. But what we did is we decided to allocate the money because we had the data that says, hey, I'm going to allocate the money from this one channel over to this other channel because I feel like it's going to drive more appointments. And guess what happened? Our cost per appointment went down by $10. Now, our cost per qualified up was just a little bit higher, but the cost per closed one and the cost per dollar pipe actually decreased as well. And for us, that was a really big win because guess what? As a marketer, I didn't really have any control past here anyways. But this was the point at which I had the most could influence up to that point by driving the right types of leads and tracking that along the journey, right? Okay. Questions so far? This is deep, right? So here's the thing. You could get this data at like a lead level on a first touch attribution model. You don't need to use campaign members to do that. So most companies, is often where they stop. So what they'll do is they'll bring the data onto the lead and then they'll transfer over to the opportunity if it gets converted. That's probably the most standard implementation of like, hey, I just want to know what's driving leads and what's driving opportunities. The challenge of that is it's a one-dimensional thing. You're only looking at the first touch. But if you remember that first slide I showed, the journey is like huge. right? So if I'm measuring success from marketing campaign efforts off of that one touch point, I'm kind of missing the picture a little bit, right? What campaign members allow you to do is they allow you to track each touch point along the journey and get detailed level information on it. The problem with a campaign is that, are we over time here? Oh no, we're still time. If you do it, you don't get like keyword data, for example, on a campaign. Because what I'd have to do is I'd have to create 50 campaigns that represent each keyword. What I need is a dynamic way to bring in that data. You know what I mean? So by having kind of open text fields on the campaign member, it allows me to do that. So I can bring in whatever data I want. And now I have both high-level information from campaign, but if I wanted to look at more detailed information, which is really important if you're managing campaigns, when you're looking at events, when you're looking at Google search, all those kinds of things, right? It's really important that you also look at, hey, how did that one campaign doing? If all of my revenue is coming from one ad group, that's pretty important to know that, right? Hi, welcome, come on in. Right, so, yeah. So the question is, how important is it for smaller companies to do it? Well, guess what? The foundation that you build as a small company grows with you, right? And guess what? Your dollars are more valuable in a small company too. So when I run a test, right? A large company will be like, I'm going to throw $20,000 at that test. A small company will be like, I'm going to spend $1,000 on this test. And if you don't have the campaign attribution in place, you might be like, oh, we got one new sale. Where'd it come from? I don't know, you know, because you don't really have the campaign tracking set up in a way that's meaningful. That answer your question? Yeah. Okay. As we wrap up here, I want to talk about one other thing called offline conversion tracking. You heard of offline conversion tracking before? Okay. So basically what it is, it's particularly relevant in Google ads and Facebook ads and in other ad platforms, right? So in offline conversion tracking, basically this is the gist of it. Somebody clicks an ad, they fill out a form, it goes into your CRM, and then it comes back to the platform. So with offline conversion tracking, what you're trying to do is close the loop for the platform to say, hey, that's great, you got a form fill and you got a conversion, but what I really want to know is, did you close the sale? By using offline conversion data, you can bring the sale data and the opportunity data back into Google Ads, and you can actually do it for phone calls as well. So I can track it all the way through the funnel, and I'll show you what I'm talking about here in a minute. But basically, end-to-end tracking gives advertisers a detailed overview of their campaigns, ad groups, audience, but it gives it to them in the platform they're in. So in Google Ads, in Facebook ads, whatever it is. And it helps them understand the quality of the leads, but it also helps them and the algorithms that Google Ads runs, for example, we take Google Ads, it actually helps optimize the Google Ads to campaigns and keywords that are actually driving revenue versus things that might be just driving form fills. There's tools like call tracking metrics or call rail that will do this on the call side as well. So if you implement it, what you can actually see, it'll show you, like here's, for example, like Google My Business. That was a Google My Business call that came in. This was a personal call or a tech support call. But if you have it integrated with Google Ads, it'll actually show you that call came from this keyword and this ad group. So you get the same data you would get on a form fill, you can actually get that on a call as well. And most people don't bring that call data back into Salesforce. So, but if you did, and you can, that'd be really valuable, right? So I'm not getting over all the details, but if you want to set up this, the biggest key here is that you enable auto tagging in your Google Ads account. And I also like to make sure you're using a tracking template that is meaningful. And so this is a tracking template, and I can share it, but this is an example of a tracking template that says, hey, whatever landing page it is, pull in this campaign name and pulling all the data so that you get it. That's basically what it's doing. What happens from a tracking perspective is there's a field called gclid, or Google Click ID. You store that in a cookie, just like we were talking about earlier. That field comes into the web form, comes into the lead and over into the opportunity, and that data now, on a standard integration with Salesforce, it'll let you track by status or stage on the opportunity. And it'll bring that data back into Google Ads. This is how you do it. Again, detailed, I'll share this. But you set up and map the fields, you connect to Salesforce account, you create custom conversions, you verify data is coming in, and then you create custom columns and create reports. Now you can create reports both in Google Ads and in Salesforce. But what's interesting is now in Google Ads, you can actually see, here's how many leads I created. Here's how many qualified leads I created, how many opportunities I created. And you can see that at the keyword level inside of the ad platform, which is super helpful when you're trying to make decisions. So here's a great example of this, right? So here you've got, if you look at this, you got this mid-funnel campaign driving 1,200 leads, 184 opportunities. What's interesting, though, is this branded campaign, which makes sense, way less leads, but look, actually has more opportunities. So I'm going to go spend money on opportunities and close data. I want to go spend it here, right? And this data now can be used by Google's algorithm to self-optimize. So there's a ton of value in bringing that data back. I can also do things like a cost per opportunity if I wanted to focus down. So you can focus further down the funnel. The reality is a lot of organizations are a lot more complex than a basic setup like that. And so you end up having to kind of create some custom integrations to allow all of that to work across all the platforms. So Facebook, call tracking metrics, you might have to add some different fields. I like to use Zapier, or if there's a flow builder, it's really helpful. But in the end, what you're trying to do, the gist of end-to-end tracking is get post-form data back into the ad platform so you can use it. So same kind of thing. This is just for Salesforce or for Facebook. But now in Facebook, for example, instead of saying, hey, how many conversions do I have? I could actually say, how many deals did I win? Go focus on the campaigns that are driving deals. For larger companies that are like doing 300,000 plus in a year, there's a new idea called a media mix model where they're saying, hey, instead of trying to worry about all the tracking, why don't we look at correlation as a way of doing this and use the data from all of these places to say, hey, where should I actually be spending the money? And so this approach takes it more of like, hey, I'm going to take this impression and click data and I'm going to basically throw it into this approach and do some what-if scenarios around it. It says, hey, what if I were to allocate more money to LinkedIn? What if I were to allocate it here? And it uses correlation to kind of do that. And so what they're trying to find is like, what are the marketing activities that are most correlated to the sales growth, and then go do more of that thing. So they're kind of saying, hey, forget about trying to track all those details in some ways. Let's just throw AI on top of it, if you will, a business intelligence platform, and let that tell us where we should go spend the money. And so they're using data like this to then say, okay, let's go find and make predictions around it. And then what they end up with is something like this, where you say, hey, let's say I had $456,000 in budget. Where should I spend my increase in budget? And then it recommends, say, hey, based on your historical data and what we're seeing in the trend in the future, we recommend that if you were to spend more money in LinkedIn ads, that you would actually increase revenue from $700,000 to $2.4 million. This model requires like a ton of data, though, right? But it is an interesting idea. There's a company called Line BI that we partner with. We have one client that they do this media mix model with. So that's it. Thanks for joining us a little bit late, but hopefully there's some value out of that. Any other questions? So basically so the question is, what falls in the camp of offline conversion tracking? In the case of ad platforms, what we're basically saying is anything that happens outside of the ad platform or online. In most cases, like the sales cycle is happening offline, right? We're saying, hey, this isn't really connected, so we got to measure that, and that's why it's called an offline conversion. You might also see things like a store sale. Somebody finds the store online and then goes to the store and makes a purchase. So there's ways you can connect that, through offline conversion tracking. But even things like events, other, all those, everything that's not online is considered offline. That's your question? Okay. Well, that's all I have then. Thanks for coming.